So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to our Redline Pod live Twitter space, focusing on Ukraine and the current crisis going on over there. Joining us today, we have an absolutely fantastic panel. We have James Kerr Lindsay, who's a professor at the University of Kent and a research associate at the London School of Economics and Oxford University, as well as a fantastic YouTube channel of his. We've got Jeffrey Edmonds, who's a senior analyst at CNA and the former director for Russia on the National Security Council, and Stephen Pifer, the former US ambassador to Ukraine, as well as a senior fellow at Brookings and a professor at Stanford University. So I'm going to start with Jeffrey and throw to Jeffrey here first. What do you think Putin's aims are here in Ukraine? What is he hoping to achieve here?
Well, I think ultimately he wants to put in a regime that's pro-Russian. I think his strategy for doing that has been pretty questionable. He's clearly, underestimated Ukrainian resistance and thought that, when you look at the Russian military forces and what they're trying to do now, they simply tried to drive in for the most part, thinking they could very quickly surround the capital, get Ukraine to capitulate in some way, shape, or form, and that the Ukrainian military would quickly fall apart right after that.
And James, what do you think the Putin's aims are here in Ukraine? What do you think his long-term strategy is here?
Well, Michael, obviously, there are all sorts of theories about what he's trying to do. The big picture is that this is about some form of control of Ukraine to one degree or another. And of course, we don't know what is going on in his mind. Was it an attempt to take control, put in a puppet regime, effectively keep it as a completely independent state, but under his control, or bring it in closer, some sort of extension of the union state that exists, or the agreement that existed on paper, but is looking much more realistic now between Belarus and Russia, or as some speculated, even some sort of much closer sort of, if you like, annexation. We just don't really know what was going on in his mind, and there are obviously a lot of options, and they all have their own sort of political, legal consequences accordingly.
So, Jeff, obviously we've seen a lot of news stories coming in, both saying Ukraine's doing very well, Ukraine's doing very badly. How do you think the Ukrainian army is fighting compared to where we thought they would be at the start of this week?
I think everybody is very surprised at the level of resistance. Well, there's two parts to that. There's the level of resistance the Ukrainians have been able to mount, and the operational blunders that the Russians have committed early on. The Russians have, these air assault missions with no close follow-on support, military convoys just driving into ambushes, getting ahead of their logistics. Whereas the Ukrainians have been fighting a very smart fight of setting up ambushes and getting into the cities, and and they still have some air assets. So the Ukrainians, I think the Russians are very surprised by the level of resistance they've seen from the Ukrainians, as is the rest of the world. But it's not uncommon for invaders to overestimate or to underestimate the resistance of a group of people defending their homeland.
James, obviously one of the major operations here was to keep Ukraine out of NATO, and that was one of the major objectives here. Do you think this is going to strengthen NATO? And obviously, I'm thinking here about the talks that Sweden and Finland have been engaging in here. Do you think we're now going to be seeing an even stronger NATO and an enlarging NATO due to Russia's invasion here?
Well, I think this has been one of the most interesting aspects, of course, of all of this. And sort of as people have pointed out, Putin, for all his efforts to try and destabilize NATO and weaken the European front, I saw a comment earlier today, which I thought was very accurate, to say that, in one swoop, he has effectively reversed 10 years of his policy to sow discord across Europe. I mean, we're seeing a far, far more united Europe than I think we've seen for a very long time. I think if you'd said 2 weeks ago that we'd be in this situation, obviously people would find it difficult to believe. But there were also a lot who would say, yes, but Putin was probably banking on the fact that, he had friends in the European Union, not least of all Hungary. And of course, what we've seen is that has all fallen away, that we've seen an incredible amount of unity across Europe, not just obviously within the European Union, but also across European Union and NATO. And as you rightly point out, one of the most interesting aspects of this has been the fact that Finland and Sweden have openly mooted the idea of some sort of possibility of NATO membership. Now, obviously, there would have to be a lot of things that would need to be worked out in that. But, the fact that they're even talking about it now, I think is incredibly significant. And it's probably going to raise questions as well amongst other EU member states that aren't NATO members, whether this is something that they should be looking into. So, as well as Finland and Sweden, we, of course, have Austria, we have Ireland, we have Malta, and we have Cyprus. I think that's the lineup. And so, maybe the debate will emerge there. Now, obviously, there's all sorts of difficulties in those. For example, Cyprus isn't going to be allowed to join because Turkey will block it. But I think we could really see this debate develop in very, very interesting ways. And one extra thing I think is also very important to note in all of this is, of course, Germany's statement about increasing defence spending. And I think that this is one of the things we are going to see across the board in all European Union and NATO member states now. Certainly in the NATO members, they're meant to be spending 2% of GDP on defence. Last count, I think it was maybe 8 out of the 30 were doing so. I think we'll see all of them shift to that. So I think it's an incredible time, and to watch this unfolding. And as I say, Putin has done wonders for European unity this past week.
So we're just bringing in Stephen at the moment, but I'm going to throw to Jeffrey again. Effectively, a lot of people are comparing this to the 2008 invasion of Georgia, where Russia effectively quickly capitulated Georgia and in 12 days effectively made, guaranteed all its positions in that country. How do you think this 2022 invasion of Ukraine compares to the 2008 invasion of Georgia?
So I think what we're all shocked, at least the military analysts that follow Russia are shocked by is the level of failure that the Russians have had just in the opening days here. They purportedly have learned a lot from 2008. There have been massive modernization efforts underway since then, and they at least in their exercises seem to have become quite formidable. But I think part of this was, a lack of their ability to plan, because most of them didn't know this was coming until days beforehand. And then the fact that it's been driven by these assumptions by the Russian leadership that have really, in a certain sense, hampered the Russian military. And I mean, I'm happy for that. But we're surprised at how much this resembles the 2008 invasion, because most of us, assumed that the Russians would make much more gains and, many more gains in the early days of this conflict.
Stephen, we have Stephen joining us right now. Thanks. I think we've solved the technical issues. So I'm going to start with give Stephen the same question we opened with everyone else with. Stephen, what do you think Putin's aims are here in Ukraine?
Well, I think what we've seen are fairly maximalist aims. When he spoke last week, he talked about demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. And when you observe the military operations that the Russians conducted, they seem to be aimed at going at Kiev. They seem to be trying to take large chunks of Ukrainian territory. And I don't see how he achieves his goals without actually trying to bring down the Ukrainian government. Now, denazification is an interesting term because what he's trying to do is depose a Jewish president of Ukraine.
So, Jeffrey, I'm going to talk to you, put this one to you. Quite often, if anyone's a World War II buff like myself, they've watched Soviet techniques. Quite often the Soviets advance on a lot of fronts and then see which one works and throw their good units and their reserves at whichever one makes the breakthrough. And we have seen breakthroughs in the south near Kherson. Do you think we are seeing that Soviet technique again of just trying all fronts and seeing which one works?
I mean, I don't think so. I think, that we kind of expected that the south would be easier for the Russians to infiltrate and maneuver in. They're really focused on Kiev and Kharkiv. What's interesting in thinking about, how the Russians are going about this, what I've said before is that you look at Russian strategic exercises, and this isn't what they train for. They usually train to fight a conventionally superior adversary, i.e. NATO and the United States, absorb a large aerospace attack, grab some land, fight back, and attrit in the hopes of getting some kind of political settlement. This is in many ways the flip side of that, where they're the invading force. And I think, going back to what your point about Soviet times, that was a very much a phased operation with artillery, reconnaissance, maneuver, and things of that nature. We haven't seen any phasing to this at all. It's like they pulled the trigger on everything at once, without really having thought the matter through. So it's all kind of bewildering at this point.
So, Stephen, I remember sitting in Russia and speaking with a Russian officer a few years ago, and he said one of his key phrase to me was, well, it's easier to conquer car parks than it is cities. Do you think if the Russians continue to lose some of these battles, they may move to a very heavy artillery doctrine and increase the civilian casualties here?
Well, I think that is very much a concern. Is thus far, the Russians seem to be exercising some degree of restraint. But there seems to be some sense of frustration setting in that they haven't achieved their goals. Now, it may well have been that the Russians significantly underestimated the Ukrainian military and their ability to resist. My understanding is that these Russians have still yet to commit a major part of their invasion force, because they may have thought that they could get in, that the Ukrainians would not resist to the level that they've seen over the past 5 days.
So, James, even if the Russians do manage to take Kiev and put a Russian-friendly oligarch in power here, do you think the European powers are going to be willing to recognize any puppet government in Kiev, or they're just going to start treating them in much the way they've treated Belarus at the moment?
I think it's obviously going to raise all sorts of very, very important questions. It might stray off into questions of international law. And issues to do with recognition is that traditionally what would have happened until about 30, 40 years ago is that you actually had the principle of the recognition of governments that ran alongside the recognition of states. So you would say, we recognize X country, and then after every election or after a coup or whatever it was, then they would take the position on recognizing the government of that. And that actually fell out of fashion. But what we are starting to see is that this is now becoming a much more important and interesting question in international relations. And we saw it actually end of last year in a completely unrelated issue, which of course was the fall of Afghanistan and the takeover of the Taliban government there, that hasn't been recognized by any country as yet as the official government of Afghanistan. But we could also be seeing a very similar situation here, where a lot of European countries and Western countries will simply say, we aren't willing to accept this government. And there will also be questions then about who takes the seat for Ukraine in the United Nations. And that will be very important. And these are the sorts of debates that we haven't been having for a very, very long time in international relations, which are actually starting to come to the fore again. So it's going to be a fascinating question that if should, God forbid, that Ukraine fall to Russian control, that we will have to ask some very serious questions about how then we respond to whatever regime is put in power.
Michael, could I jump in here for a second?
Yeah, of course. Jump in, Stephen.
Because I think there's also the question, would the international community accept a Russian-imposed oligarch, or basically a Russian-imposed puppet government in Kiev? But there's also the question, will the Ukrainians accept that government? And my guess is that government would be hugely dependent on Russian military support, Russian security service support, because if that support ever left, if the Russians left, that government could not survive more than 2 or 3 minutes. So this is, I think, a dilemma for the Russians if, in fact, they want to have a government in Ukraine, in Kiev, that will be pro-Russian. They're going to have to plan, I think, a major security and military presence in Ukraine, or whatever part of Ukraine they occupy, in order to sustain that government.
So if you just joined us, this is a live Twitter Space panel between the Red Line podcast, as well as Stephen Pifer, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and senior fellow at Brookings, Jeffrey Edmonds, a senior analyst at CNA and former director for Russia for the National Security Council, and James Lindsay, professor at the University of Kent and a YouTube star with his channel, which I watch far too often. So I'm going to throw this next question to Jeffrey. When you look at these videos coming back out of the conflict at the moment, you're seeing that most of the equipment's quite old. It's not the Russians' best units. Why are we seeing, the kind of the B team in most of these offensives? Why aren't we seeing the T-14s rolling up here? Yeah,
so that's been a big mystery for a lot of us. I mean, over the last 12, 24 hours, we have seen a greater number of modern platforms like the Su-34 modern, it's a close air support and strike aircraft. That's one of Russia's newest and most capable. We're starting to see more of those, but you're right. There's been a number of columns that we've seen on the road that have not even the mainstay modernized T-72 BM3s, and I that's kind of puzzling to us. But to Stephen's point, the Russians have a lot more to throw into this fight, and so I think we're going to see more of the more advanced weapons. But I also think we're unfortunately going to probably start seeing a much more heavy-handed technique in trying to take control of cities. And unfortunately, they have a lot of capabilities for doing that they demonstrated repeatedly in Syria.
Stephen, do you think we're looking at Kharkiv as a model for what we're going to see forward? So house to house, street to street fighting, or the Russians will mostly just surround the big cities and continue want to move past them and try and take as much ground as possible before peace talks really kick in?
Well, I think if the Russians want to satisfy their goal, and this is their presumed goal of deposing the government, they have to take Kiev. They can't simply surround it. They've got to take Kiev. And that's where I do fear. I think that we begin to see much heavier application of force. And it goes back to some of the nightmare scenarios of how the Russians applied force against Grozny back in the Russian Chechen wars.
So, James, obviously there are other countries watching the US response here, particularly being Taiwan, Bosnia, and some of the Balkan nations. Are these guys that watching it? Should the US be doing more to demonstrate that, yes, if China were to invade Taiwan or Serbia were to invade Bosnia, that the US, even though they aren't official NATO members, would respond in some manner?
Well, I think obviously the big question, the one, the country which will be watching this most closely is, of course, China. There has been a lot of discussion in recent years, and especially over the past year or so, about whether China is sort of looking more seriously at the possibility of taking military action against Taiwan to exert control. And I think Beijing will obviously be sort of watching this. I mean, obviously, it would be a very, very different type of conflict. China obviously doesn't share a land border with Taiwan. It would have to be some sort of invasion force, naval air force. So we'd be talking about, I think, a very different type of conflict. But I think China will also be looking at the reaction to this. And I think we'll probably be rather concerned at the degree of Western solidarity that we've seen and the very, very quick way that Western countries have responded to cut Russia off from all sorts of, from trade, from aid, from banking, across the board. So I think, Beijing will be watching this. I mean, of course, there's always the danger that China would tell itself, well, look, we're even more important than Russia. They wouldn't dare. But I think also there will be those who will also be thinking, well, that would probably be exactly what Vladimir Putin was thinking 2 weeks ago.
Stephen, the same question to you. Do you think China and the Balkans are watching this closely?
Yeah, no, I think they are. And so far, my guess is, from the Chinese perspective, they have perhaps been surprised by the strength and unity of the Western response. And I think in China's case, particular attention being paid to the economic sanctions on Russia and the havoc that they are wreaking on Russian markets this morning. And from China's perspective, they have to consider that they have a much larger part of their economy tied to trade with the United States, with Western Europe and such. And so they have to be thinking about, were they to make a move on Taiwan, what would be the impacts on their economy if the West imposed similar measures on China as they've now imposed on Russia?
So I have my Twitter DMs open at the moment. So if anyone listening has any questions for our panel, you can always DM at the Redline Pod, and I'll be answering some questions there, and we'll bring those questions to our panel. But Jeff, I'm going to throw this one to you. We have seen the Russian nuclear forces going on alert in the last 24 hours. Obviously a lot of people are worried about this. Do you think it's something we should worry about, or just Russia responding to Finland and Sweden and trying to bolster its chest where, it doesn't have a lot of troops sitting at the moment?
Right. So the actual move was to put their strategic deterrent forces on higher alert, which on the Russian side actually includes both conventional and nuclear forces. But you're correct. People are worried about the nuclear side of this. But even people in Russia that I've spoken to, no one is real clear on what exactly this higher level is. I know U.S. officials have said that they're not seeing a bunch of activity. I think at this point, this is signaling, and it's not surprising to me given the impacts of sanctions. There was the German statement about Putin needed to go. There's Finland, all of this boiling up in one person. I mean, I don't like to reduce Russia to one person, but that's really what we're talking about right now. And he's historically pretty quick to start mentioning nuclear weapons whenever there's talk of tangling with Russia. So in many ways, this doesn't surprise me. I think it's bluster at this point. But if this conflict widens beyond Ukraine, it is something we definitely need to be very concerned about.
So, Stephen, I'm going to throw this one to you. Effectively, if there is a partition of Ukraine, is Russia likely to ask for just Luhansk and Donetsk, or is it likely to ask for the areas around Odessa, Mariupol, and Berdyansk, as well as Kherson, to allow the water to flow into Crimea easily, which has been a big problem for the Russians in the last year or so?
Yeah, well, again, I think the Russians have to understand that to the extent that they wish to occupy Ukrainian territory that goes much beyond what Russian proxy forces have occupied for the past 8 years in the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. That's only about 35% of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. They're going to have to contend with, I think, a fairly active resistance. If you're thinking about the Russian perspective, the more territory that they partition under Russian control, the bigger, I believe, their resistance problem is going to be. My guess is that they probably want to stay away from Western Ukraine. That's traditionally been the most nationalistic and most, in the area of Ukraine, most hostile to Russia. But I think after the past 8 years, beyond the territory that they've occupied since really 2015, they run a significant chance of encountering resistance operations pretty much everywhere in Ukraine now.
So, James, we have seen Ukraine apply for EU membership this morning, and that is quite a significant move. Do you think, A, the EU will let them in, and B, that what do you think Russia's response will be if they are allowed into the European Union?
Yes, I mean, obviously, it was very interesting to hear the Ukrainian president refer to, make this application to join the European Union. And of course, Ukraine has an association agreement with the EU. But I think it's important to sort of bear in mind, there will be people who are sort of, and I've seen voices saying, "Oh, we should do this. This is really important," and everything like that. But I know it probably sounds completely inappropriate at a time of conflict and what we're watching at Ukraine, but you just can't give out EU membership like that. It's far more complex than that. There's a whole set of hoops that have got to be jumped through, and people could say, "Oh, but there's a political will there." No, I mean, you've got to understand that European Union is fundamentally an economic project. And that countries have got to be able to, it runs into the very, very ethos that we saw over Brexit of what the European Union stands for. You can't just give it away. And I think, the other thing we have to bear in mind is that, Ukraine is a country with a lot of other problems, and it's big, it's problematic. There's been terrible problems with corruption. These are sorts of things that just can't be glossed over to take it in on, if you like, a whim. And that I use that sort of cautiously. I'm aware, as I say, of the circumstances we're talking at the moment, but that isn't, of course, to say that the West can't be doing as much as it possibly can. And, it can make a symbolic statement to say that, with that association agreement in place, that it accepts that Ukraine is a candidate. You might be able to jump one or two early hoops in the accession process, but the idea that it's just going, European Union can just throw away the rule book and take it in, I think that's just absolutely impossible. And it will also, there will be a lot of other countries which would then say, well, yeah, we understand the situation with Ukraine, but what about us? There's a number of countries, 6 countries in the Western Balkans that are lining up with their own problems that would like to be able to join. So, as I say, I think, as much as people would like to see this as some sort of act of solidarity, it's not going to be happening.
Michael, can I ask you a second too?
Yeah, of course. Jump in.
Ukraine and EU would also be a big problem for Russia. Remember back in 2013, Russia actually had a Ukraine that was neutral with regards to NATO. Then Viktor Yanukovych was president. He made clear he did not want to join NATO. He did not want a membership action plan with NATO, but he was negotiating the association agreement with the European Union. And in the second half of 2013, the Russians applied immense pressure on Yanukovych not to do that. And in the end, Yanukovych succumbed to that pressure. And within hours, that triggered the Maidan Revolution. So there's also, I think there's a Russian angle here. I mean, the Russians are not wanting to keep Ukraine just out of NATO. It's also out of institutions such as the European Union.
So if you just join us, this is a live Twitter Space panel discussing the conflict in Ukraine. And joining us today is Stephen Pifer, former US ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Edmonds, senior analyst at CNA, and James Lindsay, a professor at the University of Kent. And Jeffrey, I'm going to throw this question to you. There is a lot of people talking about escalation, whether that be sending Polish troops in to help people evacuate out of cities like Lvov, or even imposing a no-fly zone over Ukraine by NATO. How risky is that of escalating this conflict into something far, far more dangerous?
Well, I think the no-fly zone is there's no question about that. Would be a direct that would just result in a NATO clash with Russia. There's no way to do. You can't just declare it and expect the Russians to back out of Ukrainian airspace. And so, in order to force it, it would be, to me, it's the equivalent of just saying we're going to send in NATO aircraft to shoot down Russian aircraft. So I don't expect that to happen. I think there's a lot of room for unintended escalation. I think the Russians will see any NATO troops inside Ukraine as an escalation, and then the Russians may escalate themselves. I mean, if you get chaos on the streets in Moscow, and the Russian leadership or Putin feels that he's losing control of the state, then I think you would see intentional escalation from his side.
Obviously, that leads me to this next question, Stephen, is about the escalation here. Frankly, the sanctions are going to bite, but we don't know how badly they will bite the average Russian person. Do you think this may destabilize Putin's position if people are starting to economically struggle in Russia, or frankly, he has such a hold on this and a bit of a cash reserve in anticipation of the West sanctions here?
Well, I think this is the big question and potentially the big risk to Putin. I mean, certainly he has done a lot in the last 22 years to build an autocratic state with a strong security service to control the population. But the Russian economy has been stagnant basically for the last 10 years, with the exception of a burst of growth last year as they came back from COVID. But I think you're seeing a lot of questions by Russians. Why are we going to war with Ukraine? You've seen protests. And if now the economic situation begins to press down on them, I mean, some of the ways the sanctions, as I understand this, and I'm not really versed well in these financial sanctions, but as was explained to me, the sanctions applied on the Russian central bank will allow the Russian central bank still to, for example, receive money, but it just won't be able to spend it. So there are already some reports that Putin has ordered a halt to any transfer of foreign exchange from Russia to outside Russia. So I think the economic implications here could be pretty dramatic. And if you pile that on top of a population that seems to be questioning why they are sending the Russian army in to fight their brother Ukrainians, and for the last 10 years, Putin has talked about we Russians and Ukrainians are one people. It will be interesting to see what the Russian public does, and does that begin to have an impact on the Kremlin's decisions?
So, James, this question's for you. Obviously, when the US went into Afghanistan or goes into Iraq, it usually goes in with a coalition of nations. Russia usually has the CSTO to back it in operations like this. Why haven't we seen Kazakhstan or Belarus or, Armenia or any of these CSTO nations jump in and help Russia in this occupation?
Well, I think this is obviously an excellent question. Probably something that to be honest, I think Jeffrey might be sort of better placed to address. I think there will be some raised eyebrows about why maybe some of the countries haven't been sort of more actively involved. I think one, for example, we'd be thinking Armenia and Kazakhstan. I think would be sort of quite obvious cases, especially Armenia. There would be the argument that, well, Armenia is in a very tenuous position. It hasn't got a lot of scope to disagree with Moscow on anything at the moment, as long as sort of Russian notional so-called peacekeepers are operating in what remains of Nagorno-Karabakh. So, there may well have been a lot of pressure brought to bear on Armenia over that. But yes, I think there will be questions asked about this. But of course, the flip side of this has been that we have seen this closer relationship between Belarus and Russia. And I think that this really has cemented the fact that Belarus is now the junior partner of Russia in this situation. And it will be very interesting to see if Putin sort of does actually bring into full effect the Union state. And of course, going back to the point I made earlier, that would raise then very real questions about whether we can still consider Belarus to be a truly independent state. Now, by quirk of history, in fact, Ukraine and Belarus were founder members of the United Nations and actually had seats in the United Nations, even as part of the Soviet Union. And so there is a bit of a precedent that could be going on in Putin's head here of sort of effectively putting these back under Moscow's direct control, but claiming that they are independent states and keeping them in the UN and just giving Russia a couple of extra votes where it might matter.
So, Jeff, you've seen James throw you under the bus there. I'm going to throw this question to you. How is this going to affect Russia's relationship with the Cso Nations?
So I think that, like you said, I think they're in a tenuous position. I think they'll kind of sit on the sidelines for this. I mean, Kazakhstan isn't a client state. I think when it comes to Belarus, I think Lukashenko gave up sovereignty in exchange for stability in a certain sense. And I think that, they're very complicit in this invasion. I don't think that gets as much play as it probably should. But I mean, I think the longer this goes on, the more I think all of his positions weaken, even in CSTO.
So, Stephen, this question's for you. Obviously, the Europeans have been quite reliant on Russian gas for quite a long time. Do you think, this will actually convince the Germans and a few of these other European nations to get off Russian gas? And frankly, if they do that, can they actually meet any of their environmental targets?
Well, I think it does convince Europe to take a very hard look about the wisdom of being so dependent on Russia for natural gas. I've actually heard that there's even a discussion begun in Germany over the weekend about whether they might want to extend the lifetime of some of the nuclear power plants that they're supposed to shut down shortly. And that would ease some of the pressure on their gas demands. But the issue, of course, for Russia is that looking out past 2030, if Europe and the European Union are in fact serious about the green agenda that they've laid down, and it's very true, I think, in Germany now, with the Greens a member of the coalition government, you're likely to see Europe's demand for natural gas decline beginning in 2030. So that may ease some of the problem. But my guess is that at this point in time, there's a lot of thinking going on about how can they reduce the dependence on Russia when there's a concern that Russia might try to weaponize that dependency.
Well, staying on Germany here, James, we have seen the Germans talk about rearmament and rebuilding up some of their armed forces after this, with many German members talking about the stability of Europe being shattered. Do you think the German army will go through a bit of a renaissance and they will start to rebuild many of their armed forces?
Well, without being a specialist on German politics, it's hard to say. But I think what we certainly seen from outside, and the monumental statement that we saw over the weekend by the new German government to sort of signal that they are going to increase their defence spending, that they're going to put in a huge sum, 100 billion, into defence spending. I mean, that really is a significant expenditure. Now, I can't remember the exact sort of lineup of where countries fall. I mean, put that in perspective. The United States is spending a little over 700 billion a year on defense, and that puts it way ahead of, in fact, actually the next 9 or 10 countries in terms of defense expenditures. The United States is a huge heavyweight. The number 2 on that has been China, which I think is running about 250 billion. And then we start to sort of fall on to, I think it's Russia, sort of Britain, France. And so Germany, by all accounts, if I remember rightly, will leapfrog the UK on defence spending with that. So that's a huge outlay and sends a very, very powerful message. And of course, it is a new administration that we're seeing in Berlin. And I think there were lots of questions about, how it was going to take over from Merkel. Merkel was this obviously huge towering figure in European politics. And I think the first signs, are proving to be very positive. And I think, that, there was probably a lot of concern about how Germany was going to handle this crisis. And the fact that it has come out, it stood for the sanctions. It said, right, okay, we're going to take up the defence expenditure, is probably going to have gone down very, very well in not only across Europe, but also across the Atlantic.
So, Jeff, obviously, we've seen so many people talk about Russia's cyber capabilities for years now, and as this, monolith of being able to do massive cyber attacks. But frankly, it's been pretty underwhelming. Ukraine's had their internet up most of the time. We haven't seen the collapsing of Ukraine like a lot of cyber experts were imagining might happen. Do you think that's an apt assessment here? Do you think Russia has been somewhat underwhelming in its cyber capabilities in this conflict?
I mean, I think it's hard. It's hard to tell. I think cell phone coverage can also be targeted with electronic warfare, and they might be reluctant to do that so they can communicate with their own troops. It's hard to tell from the outside, exactly what cyber operations they've conducted. But yeah, I would say that it is bizarre. Like the other things I've said today. There's a lot of bizarreness about this invasion, and that we haven't seen more of that. I mean, I've seen some earlier before we got on this Twitter space. I saw different reports about some potential cyber attacks in Europe targeting things like windmills or satellites or things of that nature. But yeah, we haven't seen any major cyber offensive, and that could either be because we were overestimating what we would actually see, or we were overestimating what they would actually do.
Stephen, I asked this question earlier on, but that was before you get me on the panel. If the Russians do sort of advance further up past Odessa, that does bring them up to Transnistria, the breakaway republic in Moldova. Do you think they might activate the forces in Transnistria? And do you think Moldova should be worried about what's happening in Ukraine at the moment?
My understanding is that the Russian forces in Transnistria are actually relatively small. I think you're talking about less than 2,000 troops. So if they do come into play, I think it would be a relatively minor operation. In Moldova, I'm not sure they need to worry. It seems to me that right now the Russian military may be finding that it has its hands fairly full with Ukraine, and it probably needs to resolve that first. But also, I think there has to be a calculation in the Kremlin that if the Russians were now to move on Moldova, the alarm bells that are going off all over Europe this week just triple.
So, James, how do you think the Europeans are going to react to this when the casualties start building up? We have seen quite low casualties at the moment. The Russians are doing what they can to keep civilian casualties to less than we see in standard Russian operations to do with Syria. If this effectively moves to a much nastier, much more artillery-driven conflict, how do you think nations like Poland and Germany and France and Britain will react to that?
Well, it's going to prove for very testing times because I think obviously there will be those who will say, why aren't we doing more? And I think, most of us understand exactly why we can't do more in this situation. I think one thing actually was mentioned earlier, which I thought was sort of worth mentioning, was about, in terms of this escalates. And, we've already seen talk already that maybe people going from various countries to help the Ukrainians to fight for them. Of course, we had the British Foreign Secretary suggest that, if that was something that British citizens wanted to do, she wasn't going to stop them from doing it, which, but, and as much as I think people would feel that that would be an extremely helpful measure, there is always the danger that this will also be used by Putin. You just need to capture a few of these and just say, they pretend they're not NATO forces, but this is NATO entering into this conflict, that could actually be a very, very dangerous step. I think, Europe's been very clear about supplying weapons, but, one does, as I say, maybe get into much more dangerous territory if you start seeing people going there, even of their own volition. But also, I think there will also be a lot more voices that will coming out and say, what, maybe Ukraine should just give in to Russian demands, that, it's so important to stop the fighting, that, why doesn't it accept neutrality? And again, we're starting to see those voices, sort of coming out in certain courses. They're not very loud at the moment, but I think if the fighting gets a lot worse, then, I think on the one hand, one would say, well, there's the possibility European solidarity will strengthen on this. But I think we might see humanitarian cracks appearing of people saying, look, the Ukrainians are just taking a hammering, maybe they should just capitulate and let's see if we can get them the best possible deal. So I think on balance that the position is probably stronger in terms of unity. But, again, we've seen this with every conflict that's arisen, that it does eventually lead to, wedges being driven. And I think one of the interesting things, just on another point that was brought up, is about the information warfare side of things, that hasn't been nearly as strong or as effective as I think many people might have imagined, and what we've been seeing in recent years. I haven't seen nearly as much effects of the trolling and the bots. But also, I think what has also been very, very telling is that the ability of the Western countries to respond to this, the information tactics that they've been deploying at the moment, is so much more effective, I think, than anything that we've seen before. So that's sending out a good sign. So that's hopefully going to say, look, we can respond to the information war that Putin will be waging. So obviously, it's a very, very complex picture that we're going to see develop. And the longer this goes on, the more complex that picture, that wider international public opinion picture is likely to become.
So we're going to have to start to bring this panel to a close, and I'm going to leave everyone with this kind of last question. I'm going to start with Jeffrey. How long do you think this conflict's going to go on for, and how do you think this ends? Do you think a partition of Ukraine, a change of government? What do you think? How do you think this conflict ends in your crystal ball?
So I actually think the conflict's going to go on for quite some time. I think it's going to, move more and more into urban areas, and it's going to be harder for the Russians. It's just going to take a longer time, and they're going to, like I said, they're going to have to bring in much more firepower to make that happen. The problem with the end of this is that I don't really see an end to it, in the sense that either side is satisfied anyway. I don't think that they're going to sue for some kind of deal in the spirit of Minsk or anything like that. I think what you might have in the end is Russians holding on to, to Stephen's point earlier, you have some kind of, maybe the leadership is left for Lviv, and you've got somebody, or they're in exile, and you've got some kind of puppet government in Kiev that that cannot survive on its own. And so the Russians are stuck in the country trying to prop this up while they're continuing to feel the effects of the economic sanctions. And right now there's so much momentum behind punishing Russia for this. I don't think we've seen the end of those, and not just sanctions, but like all of the other economic steps that individual companies and leaders have taken. And so it's a pretty dark place. So it's not very clear where the bottom of this actually is.
Stephen, same question. Where does this end, and how long do you think it goes for?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's difficult, at least right now, to see a negotiated settlement between the Russians and the Ukrainians, simply because the Russians' demands are so maximalist. I mean, the Russians want to depose the government, demilitarize the country. The Ukrainian government cannot accept that. So negotiations might gain traction at some point down the road, but I think for the near term, they're not going to make much impact. Now, I still think it would be useful for the West to be signaling things like, look, the sanctions that have come on can come off if the Russians withdraw. I mean, that these are not sanctions meant to punish Russia forever. They're linked to a specific goal, which is to get to Russia to end this war and withdraw their forces from Ukraine. But how it ends is going to be hard to determine. I suspect you're going to see fighting for some significant amount of time yet to come. And it maybe ends in one of two ways. One, the Russians do, in fact, at some point take Kiev after what could be a really ugly battle. But then Russia is stuck with occupying Kiev and a large portion of Ukraine. And my guess is that there will be resistance, that this is going to be the kind of thing where it doesn't end with the so-called victory when the Russian flag goes up over Bankova, the presidential administration headquarters in Kiev, because that resistance will continue just as the United States found out in Iraq and just as the Soviets found out in Afghanistan. Now, I think there's a small chance that at some point the Russians, and perhaps driven by Russian public opinion, there is pressure on the Kremlin to stop this. And hopefully that pressure would be exercised as quickly as possible. I think it's a small chance that pressure develops. I think it's a small chance that it would affect Putin, but there may be some chance where internal pressure, domestic pressure within Russia leads the Kremlin to try to look for some kind of face-saving way out. And if that face-saving way out involves withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine, then the West ought to be looking to ways to help them find that face-saver.
And lastly, James, how do you think this conflict will end, and how long do you think it's going to go for?
Trying to provide any sort of answer from where we stand at the moment. I mean, I think there are so many dynamics. I think, one of the things we haven't explored, which I think would have been really interesting, and perhaps for another session with other speakers, is to discuss, just how strong Putin is within Russia. I mean, the economy will be taking a huge battering. It's been pointed out that the Russians aren't as cut off as people often imagine. to the outside world. They will be getting alternative messages. Now, they will be completely bombarded at home with the official propaganda, but we are seeing protests on the streets, and one wonders if those around Putin, especially the much wanted oligarchs, are actually going to be sort of thinking to themselves, is this really the place that we want to be? So that I think is probably the wild card in this whole discussion at the moment. We have been focusing very much on a quick Russian victory, and I think we all took it for granted that was happening. And I think there has been a lot of surprise that how fiercely the Ukrainians have fought back. Not to say that we didn't think they would fight at all, but the fact that they put such strong resistance against Russia has come as a surprise. And maybe we will see another surprise in all of this, that this conflict ends from Moscow, but at this stage it's incredibly difficult to say. But I would echo the points that the others have made, which is to say that from where it looks at the moment, even if Russia does take control of Ukraine, it's going to have to stay in indefinitely. That as pointed out, if they install a puppet government, that puppet government will not survive if Russia then walks out. So we are likely to be talking that if Putin stays in power and he weathers this, that we could see a prolonged Russian occupation of Ukraine.
I want to say a huge thanks to all three of our panelists today, James Kerr Lindsay, Stephen Pifer, and Jeffrey Edmonds. I want to say thanks to everyone who tuned in for this panel. It's obviously things are moving so quickly and we wanted to do something on Ukraine. I'm sure the Red Line will be doing a full deep dive on this very soon, and we'll probably end up having some of today's guests on that program. I also want to say thanks to everyone who sent questions through. It's about 3 a.m. my time, so I'm going to head to bed after this, but I will be jumping on those tomorrow. And anyone who didn't get their question answered, I will take the time and I'll go through and answer those questions for you the best I can. But once again, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in. This will be available on the Red Line's YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And tune in for the next one. I'm sure this won't be the last panel we do on Ukraine, and it won't be the last panel we do on other subjects. We've done a few of these now and they've been a lot of fun. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for our panel, and have a good night.